Single dad bought her a $5 coffee, not knowing she was the CEO who canceled his $20 million in contract. Logan had exactly $5 left in his wallet, the last bill before his company's account hit zero. He bought that coffee for a stranger beside him in the rain because she had forgotten her wallet, because the weather was miserable, because that was the kind of man he was. She looked at him, not with the eyes of someone being helped, but with the eyes of someone who recognized something rare. 3 days earlier, that same pair of hands had signed the paperwork canceling his $20 million contract, sending everything he had built into freefall. He didn't know that yet. When a man's last $5 reaches the very woman who destroyed him, does truth arrive before forgiveness? Keep reading. If anyone had asked Logan Merritt to describe himself, he would have paused longer than most men do. Not because he was searching for the right adjective, but because he genuinely didn't spend much time on that kind of thinking. He was 38 years old. He ran Merritt Construction, a mid-sized infrastructure company based in Chicago with 140 employees, and a reputation that had been built over 11 years by being present, being honest, and delivering what was promised. He had started the company with a used pickup truck, 2 former colleagues, and a line of credit he had spent 2 years paying back. He was not wealthy by Chicago standards. He was solvent, hard-working, and proud of it in a quiet way that didn't require an audience. He showed up early to job sites. He knew his employees' names and something real about each of them. He returned phone calls himself instead of having an assistant do it. He had become, without intending to, the kind of employer that people talked about at family dinners, the ones who feel like they're working for a person rather than a machine. 3 years before the autumn in question, his wife had been killed in a car accident on the Eisenhower Expressway during a February ice storm. The other driver had run a red light and the impact had been instant, which was what people said when they were trying to make the worst thing bearable. Logan had not fallen apart. There was no time to fall apart, and beyond that, falling apart was not something his nature allowed. He had a company to hold together and a team counting on him and a version of himself that he needed to maintain for the sake of something larger than his own grief. So he had gone back to work 5 days after the funeral, and he had kept going back, and most people around him had eventually stopped watching him for signs of collapse, because he never gave them any. Whether this was strength or avoidance was a question he had stopped asking himself, because the answer didn't seem to change anything either way. The 18 months leading into that particular autumn had been the hardest stretch Merritt Construction had ever faced. Material costs had spiked across every category due to supply chain disruptions that the industry hadn't anticipated and hadn't recovered from. 2 major municipal projects had been delayed by permitting backlogs, tying up his equipment and his crew without generating revenue while the carrying costs continued to accumulate. His line of credit was stretched to the margin. 3 of his best engineers had started fielding calls from competitors, and Logan had responded with what he could: small raises, project flexibility, personal conversations, but he knew he was fighting a holding action. And then, after 8 months of proposal revisions, site assessments, and negotiations with a team that seemed to add conditions every time a deal was within reach, Merritt Construction had been awarded a contract with Harrington Group for $20 million, the redevelopment of a commercial corridor on Chicago's west side. It was the largest single contract in the company's history, and it arrived at the precise moment when Logan had started privately running projections that he hadn't shared with anyone. When the signed copy came through on a Friday afternoon, Adrian, his business partner and financial director, had brought a bottle of whiskey to the office and poured it into paper cups. The entire team had gathered around. Logan had let himself smile in a way he hadn't in a long time. It would take 2 years to complete. It would stabilize everything. It would give him room to breathe. He had no idea that the breathing room would last exactly 19 days. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. Adrian called first, and his voice carried the careful, controlled quality he used when he was trying not to let alarm travel through the phone before Logan had seen whatever it was himself. Logan pulled the email up at a red light, something he knew he wasn't supposed to do: read the first 2 sentences, and then pulled into a parking lot on Michigan Avenue to read the rest. The message was from Harrington Group's legal department. Merritt Construction's contract was being terminated under Clause 14.3, the force exit provision that had been buried in the agreement beneath 4 pages of standard construction language, and which Logan's attorney had flagged during negotiations as broad but not unusual. The stated reason was internal strategic restructuring. There was no phone call. There was no meeting. There was no explanation beyond 3 cold paragraphs and a digital signature at the bottom: Giselle Monroe, Chief Executive Officer, Harrington Group. Logan sat in that parking lot for 6 minutes. He did not call Adrian back immediately. He looked at the email one more time to be certain he had read it correctly, and then he sat and watched the traffic on Michigan Avenue move past him and thought about the whiteboard on his office wall and the names written on it in his own handwriting. Then he called Adrian and said, "Find me everything you can about her." What Adrian found took less than 2 hours. Giselle Monroe was 34 years old and had been appointed CEO of Harrington Group exactly 6 weeks earlier, following the abrupt resignation of the previous CEO under circumstances that the company had declined to explain publicly. She had an MBA from Wharton and a decade of work at two of the largest strategy consulting firms in the country, where she had developed a reputation for the kind of clinical decisiveness that people in boardrooms found either admirable or alarming, depending on whether they were the ones making the decisions or the ones on the receiving end. She had been brought in, as far as anyone in the industry could tell, to prepare Harrington Group for a fourth-quarter IPO that the board had been positioning toward for 2 years. And in the 6 weeks since her arrival, she had terminated 4 vendor contracts with a combined value of $61 million. Merit Construction was the smallest of the 4. It was also the one with the least financial leverage to fight back, which may or may not have been a coincidence. The legal analysis was merciless. Clause 14.3 had been drafted with exceptional care, the kind of care that suggested someone had anticipated exactly this kind of use for it. Challenging the termination in court would cost an estimated $400,000 in fees, take between 12 and 18 months to resolve, and carry roughly even odds of success. Logan did not have $400,000. What he could afford even less was the extended uncertainty, because the damage was already cascading in real time. 3 subcontractors demanded their deposits returned within 30 days. The bank tightened Merit's credit line within the week following the termination notice. 2 of the 3 engineers Logan had been managing carefully accepted offers from competitors before the month was finished. Adrian ran the numbers on a Thursday evening, placed his laptop on Logan's desk, and said nothing. 60 days. That was the remaining runway before Merit Construction would need to file for legal protection from its creditors. Logan made a decision. He would not sue, not yet, and not as a first move. He would try to reach Giselle Monroe directly and explain what the termination had actually done, not as a legal position but as a human reality. He believed, in the way that men who build things for a living tend to believe, that most problems could be addressed if 2 people were willing to be in the same room and tell each other the truth. He called Harrington Group's executive offices 4 times over the following 2 weeks. Each time he was routed to Diana, Giselle's chief of staff, who was professional and thorough and absolutely immovable. Ms. Monroe had no available appointments for the next 6 weeks. The first time Logan heard this, he thanked her and hung up. The second time, he asked whether there was a shorter meeting format available. The third time, he explained the situation with some specificity. The fourth time, Diana said the same thing she had said the first 3 times, and Logan thanked her and hung up and went back to his office and sat at his desk and looked at the whiteboard with the 140 names on it for a long time without moving. The morning Logan bought the coffee, he had been awake since 4:45. He sat at his kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn light going through cash flow projections for the 3rd consecutive time that week, as though the numbers might yield a different result under sufficient scrutiny. At 7 he put on a coat, the gray one, slightly worn at the collar from years of use, and drove downtown for a meeting at the bank that he already knew would not go the way he needed it to. He stopped at Elm Street Coffee 2 blocks from the branch, as he always did when he had a reason to be in that part of downtown because the coffee was good and the walk helped him think. The line was 4 people long. Outside, the rain had begun in that particular Chicago way, not hard but persistent, the kind that makes everything gray and puts a chill in the air that doesn't leave until afternoon. The woman in front of him was wearing a charcoal wool coat. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She carried a leather bag over one shoulder and held her phone in her left hand. When she stepped up to the counter, she reached into her bag. Then she paused, checked again, set the bag down on the counter and worked through every interior pocket with the careful, unhurried stillness of someone who has trained themselves not to show inconvenience in public. An Americano. $5.23. She had left her wallet in the car, and the car was 2 blocks away in a parking structure, and it was raining. Logan reached into his jacket without doing any arithmetic about it. He pulled out the last bill in his wallet and handed it to the cashier. "Don't go back in the rain," he said. It was not a grand gesture. He said it the way you say something obvious to someone you've just decided to be decent to. The woman looked at him directly for a moment. "That's kind of you," she said. Her voice was even and measured, the voice of someone who had spent years in rooms where she was one of the few people she trusted to stay calm. She moved aside to wait, and he ordered his own coffee, and because the cafe was full and the rain was picking up and there was only one empty space at the small table by the window, they ended up sitting down at the same time without planning to, and without saying anything about it, they sat across from each other and drank their coffee. They talked for about 20 minutes. The conversation was unhurried in the particular way that rain against a window can make a conversation unhurried. He told her he worked in construction. She said she was in management. Neither asked for specifics. At some point she asked him, with what seemed like genuine and unguarded curiosity, whether he ever got tired, and she said it in a way that made clear she didn't mean the ordinary physical kind. He thought about the whiteboard. He thought about the 60-day clock. He thought about waking up at 5 in the morning to look at numbers that already knew things he wasn't ready to accept. Tired in the way where you know you're not allowed to stop, he said. Yeah, all the time. She was quiet for longer than the comments seemed to require. It was the most honestly delivered sentence she had heard from another person in months. Months of meetings and briefings and presentations designed to tell her what people wanted her to do rather than how they actually were. When the rain thinned out enough to walk, they gathered their things, no names, no cards. He walked toward the bank. She walked toward a black car idling at the curb. The meeting at the bank went as expected. Merritt's credit ceiling was reduced by 30% effective the following billing cycle. Logan drove back to the office and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, listening to the engine cool before going inside. In those same weeks, inside the 42nd floor of Harrington Group's office tower on Wacker Drive, Giselle Monroe was working at a pace that made most of her staff quietly concerned. She arrived before 7 most mornings and rarely left before 9 at night. She had accepted the CEO role knowing it was a turnaround situation, knowing the company had structural inefficiencies that needed to be addressed before any IPO conversation could be credible. What she had not fully anticipated was the speed at which Sebastian would move information in front of her, or how complete the packages would look, or how little time she would have in those first weeks to do anything other than triage. The decisions came in batches. Sign here, sign there. This vendor is a liability. This contract is a drag on the balance sheet heading into the public offering. She had signed. That was what she was there to do. But the morning after Diana had set Logan's letter on her desk, something sat differently. Giselle had not become CEO by being careless, and she had become CEO by being thorough, and she had been thorough about everything except the things Sebastian had prepared for her, because Sebastian had been the one person she had trusted to do the thorough part on her behalf. She understood now, with the particular clarity that comes too late, what that trust had actually cost. 2 days later, Adrian sent Logan a link to a feature article in Chicago Business Review. The headline read, Giselle Monroe, the 34-year-old reshaping Harrington Group before its IPO. Beneath the headline was a professional headshot, well-lit, taken in an office with glass walls. The woman in the photo was wearing a charcoal wool coat. Her hair was pulled back. Logan looked at the photograph for a long time. He recognized the coat before he recognized anything else. When the face confirmed what he already understood was coming, he turned his phone face down on his desk and didn't touch it for 11 minutes. He read the full article afterward. It described Giselle Monroe as a rigorous and disciplined strategist who had brought decisive leadership to Harrington Group during a pivotal transition. The termination of legacy vendor contracts was presented as evidence of financial prudence, a balance sheet reset that had been widely praised by financial analysts following Harrington's IPO preparations. The article quoted 2 industry observers calling her moves exactly what a company in Harrington's position needs going into a public offering. There was no mention of Merit Construction. There was no mention of the 4 companies on the other side of those decisions, or the cumulative $61 million in obligations that had been walked away from, or what those numbers looked like when translated into the people they represented. Logan called Adrian. The infrastructure summit next month, she's speaking. Adrian said he already knew. Get me a ticket, Logan said. In the weeks between the article and the summit, Merit Construction continued to lose ground. The major subcontractor Logan had worked with for 7 years. A concrete and foundation company run by a man named Raymond who had been on site with him in the earliest days, formally dissolved their partnership over a materials payment that Logan had been 30 days late on for the first time in their entire history together. Raymond called personally to explain, which Logan appreciated more than he could say. He said he had suppliers of his own and simply couldn't absorb the gap. Logan said he understood completely because he did. That was one of the harder conversations of the whole period. The kind where no one is wrong and everything is still broken. Logan cut his own salary to 0 for the quarter to ensure that none of his staff missed a paycheck. He told Adrian, who was the only person who tracked those draws. Adrian looked at the spreadsheet for a long moment and then closed the laptop without saying anything, and that silence carried more weight than most conversations would have. There were mornings in that stretch when Logan drove to the office and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in. Not out of reluctance, but because the parking lot was the one place where nobody needed anything from him for 5 uninterrupted minutes. He had always been the person who held things together. He had never resented it. He just noticed lately that holding things together required a kind of constant expenditure that left very little in reserve. One evening, rather than look at the numbers again, Logan sat down with a legal pad and wrote a letter by hand. Not to the legal department. Not through his attorney. Directly to Giselle Monroe. No company letterhead, no formal salutation. Just the truth in plain language, written slowly and without performance, about what the termination had done to real people in the real world. The engineer with 15 years of service who was 2 months from having to sell his house, the 22 employees he had let go with personal phone calls, the subcontractor relationships that had unraveled in sequence like a chain with one link broken. He wrote one line at the end. I am not writing this so you feel sorry for me. I am writing because I don't think you know what actually happened. He sealed it in a plain white envelope and sent it through regular mail with no tracking and no return address beyond his name and a street number. If she read it, she read it. Diana received it on a Wednesday morning. It was different enough from everything else on Giselle's desk. No law firm logo, no corporate stamp, just handwriting in blue ink, that Diana's instinct was to set it aside rather than file it. She placed it on Giselle's desk between the morning briefings, face up. Giselle read it between her 11 o'clock and her 1 o'clock. She read it quickly the first time and then again more slowly. The letter was not polished. It did not build a legal argument or invoke emotional language for effect. It was written by someone who was not accustomed to writing but had something specific they needed to say, which gave each word an unusual weight. When she reached the section about the engineer and the house, she set the letter down and looked out the window. Then she picked it up and finished it. When Diana knocked to remind her about the afternoon schedule, Giselle asked her to pull the complete internal file on Merit Construction. Not the executive summary, everything. What she received that evening was a file approximately 3 inches thick. She brought it home. She read through it at her kitchen table past midnight. Most of it confirmed what she already knew. The termination had been processed cleanly and legally. And then, near the back of the file, she found a discrepancy that made her stop and go back. The original risk assessment on Merit Construction, prepared by Harrington's internal engineering evaluation team 8 weeks prior to the termination, was positive across every category. Financial stability adequate. Project delivery history strong. Subcontractor relationships long-standing and stable. But the document that had been placed on her desk when she signed the termination order carried the same header and the same date and an entirely different conclusion. Sections had been removed. A set of risk indicators had been added that cited internal financial modeling with no traceable source within the file. She laid both documents side by side and read them carefully, and the difference between them was not the kind of difference that could be explained by interpretation or editorial discretion. It was deliberate and thorough. She spent 2 more hours pulling the corporate structure of Caldwell Infrastructure, the company that had received the contract originally awarded to Merit. The filings listed a strategic equity partner, a limited liability company registered through a law firm she recognized from other documents. The same firm that handled several of Sebastian Vale's personal financial matters. Sebastian was Harrington Group's chief financial officer. He was 51, polished, and had been with the company through 9 years and 2 previous CEOs. He had been the first person to welcome Giselle when she took the role, had made himself immediately available, and had presented every major contract recommendation to her in the first 6 weeks with careful organization and clear summaries. She had trusted the documentation. She had been moving at a speed that left no margin for verification, in a role she had been handed without adequate transition time, in a company she was still learning. She had signed things. That was what a new CEO did. They relied on the people who had been there before them and they moved. Sebastian had known that. He had possibly built the entire arrangement around it. She called Diana at 6:45 in the morning. Clear my first 3 hours, she said. I need an outside attorney, not connected to Harrington's existing counsel, and lock the Merit file, full document control, no access from Sebastian's team. The Chicago Infrastructure Summit was held at a downtown hotel on Michigan Avenue on a Thursday morning in late October. The atrium had been set for several hundred attendees. Developers, engineers, city officials, consultants. Logan arrived at 9 and registered with his Merit Construction badge. He sat in the 3rd row for Giselle's keynote. She spoke for 40 minutes about infrastructure investment cycles and the dynamics between private capital and municipal planning. She was precise and unhurried, and moved through the material with the kind of fluency that comes from having thought about something more deeply than the presentation requires. Logan watched her and listened and tried to reconcile the person at the podium with the signature at the bottom of the termination letter, and found that he could hold both versions of the same person in mind at once, which surprised him. During the break at 10:45, he moved through the atrium with a cup of coffee he didn't drink. He watched the room. He saw Diana 20 feet from Giselle's position, near the east windows, absorbed in a call. He walked over directly. "Ms. Monroe." She turned. The recognition was immediate and visible, not just as recognition of a face, but as the particular recognition of something that had been waiting. She had read the letter. She had been holding the knowledge of who he was for days. For 3 seconds, neither of them said anything. Then Logan said quietly and without theater, "I'm Logan Merritt, CEO of Merritt Construction. You signed the termination letter on my contract 19 days ago." "I know who you are," she said. "Did you read the original risk assessment? The one your engineering team actually prepared, not the version Sebastian gave you?" Something moved behind her eyes, brief, carefully managed, but present. "It was enough. You signed the termination without seeing the underlying evaluation," Logan said. "It was not quite a question. I make decisions based on the recommendations presented to me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Based on what Sebastian built for you. Because you were 6 weeks in and he'd been there 9 years and you trusted the package." He wasn't raising his voice. The evenness of his tone somehow made it harder to deflect than anger would have. "I'm not recording this. I'm not here to threaten you or make a scene. I want you to understand what actually happened, because I believe you may not." He let her absorb that. 22 people lost their jobs. My lead engineer, 15 years with me, is 2 months from having to sell his house. The subcontractor I've worked with for 7 years went under. I called each of them personally. He paused. "The morning I bought you coffee, I had $5 in my wallet, the last $5. I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you because this was never abstract. Not to me." Giselle held his gaze and did not look away. Diana had moved closer. Giselle gave her a small shake of the head. "The original assessment," she said carefully. "You've seen it." Logan watched her, though last night or the night before. She didn't answer directly. What she said was, "Give me 72 hours. He studied her face, the same measured stillness as the cafe, but something beneath it now that was different, something she was carrying. "I've been given timelines before," he said. 4 times from your office." He stepped back. "I don't have much time left, Ms. Monroe, neither does my team." He turned and walked the length of the atrium and out onto Michigan Avenue without looking back, where the October wind was sharp and cold, and he stood on the pavement for a moment, breathing it in before he hailed a cab. Giselle stood at the window for 30 seconds. Then she turned to Diana. "Everything, all internal communications on Merritt, Sebastian's documentation trail, the original engineering assessment, and all correspondence between Sebastian's office and Caldwell Infrastructure for the past 14 months. I want it before tonight." Diana was already on her phone. What the outside attorney and the independent auditor assembled over the following 48 hours was methodical and thorough. Sebastian had constructed parallel documentation for at least 3 of the 4 terminated contracts, a clean version for the internal record and a revised version for the CEO's desk. The original assessments on all 3 had been selectively altered in ways that were specific enough to be intentional. The replacement contractors on 2 of the 3 deals had financial connections to the same network of investment vehicles that ran through Sebastian's private equity holdings. The pattern had not been built in response to Giselle's appointment. It had been built over several months in anticipation of a new CEO, any new CEO, who would arrive with limited context, high-pressure timelines, and natural deference to the CFO who had been there longest. Sebastian had not chosen her specifically. He had simply waited for the room to reset, and then walked in with the stack of papers. Giselle went to Carter with the full documentation on a Friday afternoon. Carter was the board chairman and had been with Harrington for 16 years. She laid the auditor's report on his desk and sat across from him and waited. Carter read it. He looked at it for a long time. When he finally spoke, his response was careful and diplomatic and focused almost entirely on the IPO timeline and what a public disclosure would mean for the valuation. He did not express outrage. He did not call for immediate action. He asked how many people had access to the report. He asked whether the findings needed to be shared externally. He asked whether a quiet internal settlement might be possible. By the time Giselle left his office, 2 things were clear to her. First, Carter had known enough. Second, she was entirely alone in what she was about to do, and it would cost her the position she had held for 8 weeks. She called Marcus, her outside attorney, at 8 o'clock that evening. She told him to prepare the complete documentation package for submission to the Securities and Exchange Commission and to send a parallel copy to the investigative desk at Chicago Business Review simultaneously. She told him to timestamp the SEC filing first. Marcus confirmed the instruction and then said, carefully, "You understand what this does to your position at Harrington." She said, "I understand completely. Prepare it." Sebastian was formally suspended from his CFO role on a Tuesday morning pending investigation. Within 6 hours, Carter convened an emergency board session. The motion on the floor was a vote of no confidence in Giselle Monroe's leadership, citing instability during a critical transition. 5 board members voted in favor, 4 voted against. Giselle signed the handover documents without argument or comment. She had already sent the files. The filing was already time-stamped. There was nothing left for her to hold. The story went public at 7 in the evening. The headline read, "Harrington Group CFO suspended amid fraud investigation, CEO removed after exposing internal scheme." By 9, the story had been picked up by 3 national financial publications. By 10, the Securities and Exchange Commission had issued a statement confirming receipt of the documentation and opening a formal preliminary inquiry. Harrington Group's fourth-quarter IPO was placed on administrative hold pending the review. Carter's name appeared in the 5th paragraph of the Business Review piece. Adrian sent Logan the link at 11:13 at night. Logan was sitting at the kitchen table in the same chair he had sat in that morning at 5, looking at the same projections. He read the article once and then again more slowly. He set his phone on the table and looked at the wall. He thought about a lot of things. He was still sitting there at 11:41 when his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize, which he answered on the 3rd ring out of a habit of never letting calls go to voicemail when the clock said it might matter. "Mr. Merritt," the voice was the same. The measured tone, but something had changed in it, something open, something that had been released. "This is Giselle Monroe. I know what time it is. I'm sorry for the hour, and for a great deal more than the hour." The call lasted 22 minutes. She spoke without the buffering quality of someone with legal counsel coaching from the next room. She told him she had signed documents without sufficient verification, and that regardless of who had prepared those documents, the signature was hers, and the consequences had been real, and she was not going to offer the manipulation as an excuse for what the outcome had been for Merritt Construction. She told him that the contract termination would be legally voidable. That Clause 14.3 had been invoked on the basis of falsified risk documentation, which a court would find had no valid basis. Merritt's legal team would be able to pursue full reinstatement of the original contract terms plus documented consequential damages. She was already instructing Marcus to prepare a supporting declaration for that purpose. When she finished, Logan was quiet for a moment. "Did you do this because it was right," he said, "or because the law was going to require it either way?" She didn't answer quickly, which he found more credible than a fast answer would have been. "Both things are true," she said, "but the first one came first." He sat with that. Outside the window, the neighborhood was quiet and dark. "All right," he said, "thank you for calling." He ended the call. He sat in the kitchen for a while longer, not thinking about anything in particular. Then he went to bed before midnight for the first time in 3 weeks. The legal resolution took 11 weeks. Merritt Construction's attorneys filed for declaratory judgment supported by the auditor's findings and Giselle's declaration. Harrington Group's interim legal counsel, operating under regulatory supervision, did not contest the action. The original contract was reinstated. The first payment, $4.2 million, the advance tranche that should have been released at project kickoff, was transferred to Merritt's account on a Wednesday morning in January. Adrian called before Logan had arrived at the office. His voice had none of the careful control from the call 19 days in. He said the 2 words, and Logan knew exactly what they meant, and sat in the car in the driveway for a moment before going inside. 18 of the 22 employees Logan had let go were called back. 2 had accepted positions they didn't want to leave. 2 had moved out of state. The other 18 said yes before Logan had finished asking. He called each of them personally, the same way he had called them when he let them go, and he did not frame any of it as a victory or a vindication. He said there was work again and he would be glad to have them if they wanted to return. On the first full morning, the crew was on site at the West Side redevelopment project, 60 days late from the original schedule, but present. Logan and Adrian stood at the edge of the lot and watched the crane operator run through the warm-up sequence. The machine moved. The work began. Sebastian Vale was indicted on 7 counts of securities fraud and breach of fiduciary duty 14 weeks after his suspension. Carter resigned from the board 2 days before the indictment was made public. Harrington Group began formal restructuring under regulatory supervision. The IPO was officially withdrawn from consideration for the foreseeable future. Giselle opened a strategic consulting practice in River North in February, out of a two-room office on the 6th floor of a building on Wabash. She had 3 clients the first month, none of them household names. All of them brought to her by quiet word of mouth from people who knew what she had done and understood why. Her reputation in the corporate world had sustained damage of the kind that attaches itself regardless of culpability. The kind that comes from being associated with a public collapse, even when you were the one who caused the collapse in the name of doing the right thing. Among a smaller, quieter set of people, her reputation had done something else entirely. She did not talk about Harrington Group publicly. She didn't need to. The story was already fully documented in the public record, and people who needed to understand it could read it there. She did not contact Logan again after the night of the phone call. The weeks passed, and then a month, and then 2 months, and she let them pass. There was no appropriate follow-up to that conversation, no relationship to maintain, no ongoing connection that made sense. They had occupied the same spaces a few times. Their lives had intersected in a way neither of them had asked for and neither of them had handled cleanly, and what had come out the other side was not a story of triumph or reconciliation but simply a story of what had happened, with as much of it corrected as could be corrected. That was what it was. On a morning in March, on her way to a 7 o'clock client meeting, she stopped at Elm Street Coffee. She ordered an Americano. Before she got in line, she checked her wallet. She sat at the small table by the window, the same one, and drank her coffee more slowly than she usually permitted herself to. She watched the rain move across the glass. When she stood to leave, she took a $5 bill from her wallet and placed it on the table. No one was sitting nearby. The baristas were occupied at the counter. She left it anyway, not for an audience, not to perform an emotion. She left it because she needed to do it, in the way that certain things need to be done not for their effect on the world, but for what they clarify about the person doing them. A week later, a plain white envelope arrived at Merritt Construction's offices. Logan recognized the handwriting on the outside immediately. Inside was a single $5 bill unfolded. Beneath it, a piece of paper with 3 lines written in the same deliberate hand. "I have owed you this for a long time. I hope things are moving forward. G." Logan held the bill for a moment. He turned it over once. He thought about the Tuesday morning in February when he had sat in a parking lot on Michigan Avenue and read an email that took everything he had built up to the very edge of collapse. He thought about a stranger in a cafe in the rain and the truest sentence he had said about himself in years. He thought about the whiteboard on his office wall with 140 names written on it, and the fact that almost all of them were still there. He opened the top drawer of his desk. He placed the $5 bill inside it, next to the Elm Street Coffee receipt he had never thrown away. He closed the drawer. He picked up his hard hat from the corner of the desk, grabbed his coffee, and walked out to the job site where the crew was already at work in the early morning cold, building something from the ground up, the way he always had, the way he had always known how. Some things do not get rebuilt from the beginning. They get built forward, cracks still visible, the weight of what happened carried quietly in a drawer somewhere, by people who decided that not walking away was the only kind of answer worth giving.